For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host, Jade Black, and today I'm talking about writing political thrillers in particular. This is part of a sub-series about writing different genres and also subgenres, so be that about thriller and thriller subgenres, or even going as far out as fantasy or writing for games. This is what I'm planning to do as part of the podcast this year. Today is all about political thrillers, and because this is a bit more of a craft-based episode, I feel the need to say that, as always on this podcast, I'm not here to give writing advice, necessarily. I'm just here to talk about my craft, my process, what works for me, what I enjoy, what I love doing. That's the deal. So let's get into this. Why I love writing political thrillers? Well, I love writing thrillers. I love writing about politics. I've had a long-standing interest in politics and law and things like that. So, it's just a combination of things I like, and I also like reading thrillers and crime and darker literature, and yeah, it's just a lot of things that I love all smooshed into one. It's really as simple as that. And why political thrillers are good to try? They get adapted. Potentially worth considering if you're a little more commercially minded. In terms of political thrillers that I have written, I mean, this is probably what I'm best known for in the writing community, honestly. In Mister Nakagami, that's how I got my deal with Shadowspark Publishing, for what it's worth. I'm wearing one of their shirts right now. But I've also written a political thriller in Snakebite, and there's two slightly different kinds of political thrillers as well, where Mister Nakagami focuses a lot on human rights and is more about international law and international politics and some amount of internal politics, when to put things to the Senate and stuff like that. Hanzo is more Minister for Defense and the Mayor, and a lot more of a generalist a lot of the time, and a lot of it is about internal politics, and there's a bit of international politics, but not really in the same way, so you get two different types, and Snakebite strays a little closer to political noir, probably. For what it's worth, Miss Nakagami focuses on protagonist Haru, who is sweet and adorable, and Snakebite focuses on protagonist Hanzo, who is neither sweet nor adorable. He is a bastard, but I love him anyway. A common element I've noticed with political thrillers, this is through writing them and reading and watching and just all kinds of observation, though most of this comes from writing. Travel. Travel's often a big part of political thrillers, so not necessarily detailing the journey of travel quite so much, though that can play a part. It's not in the sort of adventure sense of travel, though. It's more about, okay, so in order to fix this thing, I've got to go all the way over fucking here for no reason, because this guy can't be bothered to. It's a lot of stuff like that. Also with political thrillers, I feel like it's kind of almost too obvious to say, but betrayal is a big part of it. This is politics, baby, I don't know what you're expecting. There's a lot of not necessarily even outright political backstabbing, but just like really subtle things potentially as well, and it doesn't always stay within the political sphere. That can be within families sort of not supporting things that you thought they might, or all sorts of things like that. Romance is often a thing in political thrillers as well. I mean, there is almost the trope in political thrillers of whoever is the big fish having, an affair outside of their marriage. And romance, how it can get in the way of things like politics and careers as well. I mean, it's a common element. It's not something I feel I've written about in quite that way. It is a big factor in Mister Nakagami, but that's more of a character motivation thing. It's more that Haru would really like to be in a long-term relationship and get married and all of those things, but, you know, the whole being gay is illegal thing is the thing, so yeah, that's a big motivator for him. With Hanzo, there is an amount of romance, but it doesn't really take the forefront so much. It's just that, you know, over the 35 years or so we follow Hanzo, he enters and leaves a few relationships, and his love life is a bit of a disaster, honestly. Not as much of a disaster as him, then, necessarily. I mean, the two really big ones, well, one of the really big elements in political thrillers is economics. This doesn't factor in quite so much with Mister Nakagami, although the implications of the economy and economic policy and all that is very much felt, just in a different sense to, you know, the classic, you know, we're trying to prevent this economic apocalypse and all of that. That's almost always a thing in political thriller, whether that be, you know, we're on the cusp of a downturn or we're trying to recover from a recession, or with Mister Nakagami it's much more how the economic situation impacts the everyday person, and how when times are tough in a place like Yukai, something that happens is that people are a bit more likely to, you know, give up their kids to adoption centres and things like that, and the knock-on implications of all of that, and these kids, that how they end up growing up, and the adoption backlog, and all of those sorts of things. It's more on that side of things, but economics does, I would say without fail, probably, play a part in political thrillers, because, I mean, politics and the economy is so deeply intertwined. Yeah, you can't. That's just how it is. I mean, politics, philosophy, and economics are all really intertwined. I don't know that philosophy depending on how you define philosophy, that does also play a big part. So, political philosophy, obviously. Philosophy as the whole discipline, though, I wouldn't say so much, but I'm going to be honest, I've not taken that much time to do much with philosophy, so I might be talking out my arse. Time crunch, as with, I would say, every thriller, is, I think, particularly pertinent in political thriller, though, because, I mean, politics is a very fast-moving world. Simple as, really. And the importance of timing in thriller is particularly felt if you're dealing with something like a Senate or parliament, and when you submit things and when you don't, and how economic situations and political situations and how long different processes take, and hang on, this is taking longer than it should, who's throwing spanners, all of those sorts of things. Time and time crunch in particular is very pertinent in something like a political thriller. So, things that I often end up researching or end up thinking about a lot with writing political thrillers, well, number one, by far, know thy economics. If you're going to be talking about economics, which you almost invariably will, make sure you know what the fuck you're talking about. Make sure, if you're going to be talking about, I mean, imports and exports, this is a really classic one. Do you know what the difference between a quota, a tariff, and an embargo is? Because a lot of people genuinely don't. And if you're going to be talking about international trade, then you're going to need to know what that is, and how the interest rate affects the money supply, and all sorts of things like that. Yes, I studied economics for a while, can you tell? Nearly did an economics degree, fun fact, but I didn't. But yeah, economics is always going to be a big part of political thriller, and all the knock-on implications and what that means for the everyday person. You do need to know that. And I would also argue that you need to know a fair bit about law as well, depending on exactly what part of political thriller you're dealing with. It comes up a lot more in something like Mister Nakagami than Snakebite, about human rights law and how different bits of law are worded. I studied law as well, so got a slightly easier time with it than some people, I think. But when it comes to, is the turn of phrase for ABH, is that fear unlawful personal force, or is it apprehend unlawful personal force? It's apprehend, it doesn't mean the same thing. And how, it's just how laws are worded and how to make that feel realistic as much as anything. Not even talking about like proper legal definitions of things. If you're setting a political thriller in the real world, obviously that's a lot more important that you know like actual laws and things. If you're doing it in more of the way I have in a different alternate world, all that knowledge is still useful about, you know, the definitions of burglary that I it really annoys me to say this, I can't remember quite what the difference is between section 91A and section 91B burglary, but knowing definitions of things like that, how that's worded, what that actually means, what can actually class as burglary, because here's a fun fact for you, in the UK you don't actually have to steal anything to be charged with burglary and convicted. But again, if you don't know that, you don't know, and if that's going to come up in your plot one way or another, even if it's in the background. Let's make a little scenario. Someone's trying to steal some political documents from someone's house, and they get caught in the act, but they don't actually steal it. Well, they can still be charged with burglary, though. Actually, so you can still take this player out of the equation at least a bit, instead of thinking, well, they didn't actually steal anything, so we can't really do shit. You can still charge them for burglary, not just trespass there, because they have the intent to steal. Still counts. And I would say with this, the third thing you should really know is know thy law. And yes, I did deliberately put law and law together because it sounds the same in my accent. And in this case, I mean law, L-O-R-E, because, as I've alluded to earlier, the law you're dealing with, in terms of if you're writing an alternate world, may be slightly different or quite different to real life law, and, you know, with something like the Gays Are Illegal Act, then knowing the wording and definition and what's included in that is important for me. And also law around how the Senate works and who's there in which prominent positions and when, how long the election cycle is, and what the process is for calling votes of no confidence and things like that. That all comes up in Miss Nakagami and Snakebite, and yes, it gave me a massive headache because when I worked out how long the election cycle was, it's like, okay, so there are going to be elections on these years and these years and these years, and Haru's like, let me throw a massive spanner in that for you. Thanks, Haru. Appreciate it. I mean, I know you did it for good reasons, but still, thank you. And that actually does come up in Mister Nakagami, as at one point Haru has to be away for a while. Someone calls a snap election while he's not there, so he can't contend. Classic political shenanigans. So things I've noticed while writing political thrillers that aren't really about research and more about, I guess, the craft side of things, is pacing. Is, again, this is going to come up with probably every episode in this series. Political thrillers are, well, I alluded to earlier, they are fast-paced. You have to keep up and keep tabs on a lot of things. And while it's very fast-paced a lot of the time, and it can be a struggle to keep up, and that's almost the point, the word count will often spiral into something longer than a regular thriller, because with a regular thriller, if it's above 80k, really you're doing it wrong, and you might well be writing noir instead. With political thriller, having it nudge 80k is, or even be a little over. I wouldn't say that's unusual. You can have a short political thriller, that's absolutely possible, but generally speaking, just because of the amount of complexity and all sorts, and detail, they just end up being a bit longer. So word count you almost don't have to watch out for in the same way as you do with a regular thriller. I mean, if you're going to 100k, you probably still wanna, take a look at that and think, hang on, this is a thriller and pacing, and at that point you might be writing more of a political drama. Not clear on that because I've not dabbled in drama as much as I've wanted to, so, but worth considering. The other thing with political thrillers, and I think this is a big one, everyone has an opinion on politics. Even those of us that try and keep, we try and stay quiet about politics because we don't want to antagonize people, or, we don't necessarily know enough about a specific issue to make an informed judgment, or, we just don't have the time or energy or inclination to think about it or talk about it and just don't fucking want to and can't be asked. No matter, even if that's the case, you still have an opinion on political issues. God knows I have opinions about politics. Because that's just how the world works. It does affect us in our everyday lives. Everybody has an opinion. This is no different in fiction. And even if you've got characters who are allies, they're obviously not going to agree on everything, and methods, and how best to deal with X issue or Y issue, and how best to deal with it might be less relevant than what's actually going to get through the Senate. Because all the senators have opinions, and also the general public will have opinions, and how that influences the senators and how they're going to vote, because they don't want to piss off the public, because at the end of the day they still need to be elected, and there's also tampering as well, and this comes up in Mister Nakagami, is that, okay, well, someone might appear to relent but then end up tampering with shit in the end anyway, and that's politics, baby! Have fun! People in particular you need to keep an eye on in political thrillers, in my opinion. There is an amount of the general public you need to keep an eye on, and public opinion and things like that, and how much that can change over time. That's often a plot point, particularly if you're going over a long period of time. I've found is one thing that's really interesting to see is how public opinion changes over decades and decades, and how much of that is about campaigning and how much of that is just natural progress of society and all of that stuff. That's really interesting to see a lot of the time. But besides the general public and all of that, I mean, this is particularly relevant if you're doing elections as well, but journalists always play a really big part in this, and that a lot of that is about public opinion, and potentially if in Snakebite, when Hanzo's sort of interrogated by journalists and how he handles that in the most disgusting way, Hanzo. It was disgusting, and I love you for it, but it was disgusting. Or, with people being hounded by journalists, which is more the Mister Nakagami thing of how Haru a couple of times ends up getting hounded by journalists and people pressuring him, and how I ends up handling that. They learn their lesson, let's put it that way. But journalists, one way or another, are going to play a part at some point, even if that's more of a background role with the general public. There's somebody you should keep an eye on. Political allies as well, I think this kind of goes without saying, given the whole betrayal thing, and really I've talked about most of this already, but allegiances can quietly change, and even with someone like a mentor figure for both Haru and Hanzo and someone like Hamasaki, even once Hamasaki retires, it's not like he just disappears off the face of the continent. He's still there and still influential in his own right. He still matters, and it's still worth keeping an eye on someone like that, because you never know when he's going to pop up with, that cocky, crooked, grinless pipe and throw a spanner at something. Thanks, Hamasaki. Such a pain. Something you'll notice in this episode is how I'm talking about how all of my characters are a real pain in the ass when it comes to stuff like this. For a reason. Another set of people you should keep an eye on with political thrillers are the quiet ones, and much like with a straight thriller, the people who are quiet, and a lot of this in politics in particular is not wanting to rock the boat, but they have an opinion anyway, they don't necessarily know who to talk to, or they're just very quietly plotting something very big. And this is definitely something that happens in Mister Nakagami. There's one character who I sort of alluded to once in Black Executioner, and because I drafted that first for what it's worth, when I went back to Mister Nakagami, this guy appears out of nowhere and throws a huge spanner in the works. I'm like, excuse me, mate. Where'd you come from? And that's what happens if you don't keep an eye on the quiet ones, is you get surprised by stuff like that. And, you know, sometimes that's a really good thing. You know, I say as a pantser, if you're a plotter, yeah, maybe not. In terms of plotting versus pantsing on political thrillers, I think political thrillers probably do lend themselves very well to plotting because a lot of the time it is more plot driven than character driven. But, I mean, hey, I've pantsed too. Hardcore pants too, across very different types of political thrillers. One with an MC who's very cooperative and Haru, and one with Hanzo who goes, "Oh, what's this for? Oh, you'll see." And they both worked pretty well. I mean, hey, Mr. Nakagami got me a publishing deal, so. I think this is the thing, while I might talk about things to keep an eye on and things to know and things I've ended up researching in terms of bits of lore and bits of economics as refreshers as much as anything, or looking back over previous notebooks to check on my lore, then, you know, there's no right or wrong way of doing things. I write strictly linear, and that's a big part of how I make sure everything's working. Someone, I mean, it's a good example of any of someone who jumps around all over the place, but their work is still brilliant. Alyssa Lausang. Yes, that's dark fantasy and it's an entirely different beast, but the Keeper trilogy is amazing, and I'm super hyped for Poison and Opium, so, you know, check out Alyssa Lausang, she's great. I think that's probably about all I have for today. Obviously, there will be more stuff coming in this series. The best way to make sure you don't miss out on a genre or subgenre that you want to see, honestly, it is just to subscribe, because there's not really a schedule. I mean, you can find out advance notice of things on Instagram, but in terms of actual schedule, as and when I get interviews, because a lot of that can be arranged very short notice, I don't know if and when, you know, when things will be coming, so subscribing really is the best way to handle that. That's the long and short of it. If you want advance notice of things like when episodes come up, or soundbite teaser reels, or other things as and when I experiment with them, that is Instagram, that is the home of the podcast. I am Jade_Black21 on there. And if you want to know more about my writing, about these political thrillers, and hear more of the little details and bits of lore and lore, I'm getting way too much fun out of that, and bits about other genres I'm writing and other episodes that might come up as a result of that, that's Twitter, that's JadeBlack21. If you are looking for an interview, or then if you're published or you're well on the way, please do get in touch. I'd love to be a part of your journey at some point. This is best done via email if you want to contact me about it, jade42black@gmail.com. There is a list of things I would like to know in the description in your initial contact, so that I don't have to give automatic no's if and when I get inundated. That's the main deal, because it's no good for anybody, so make sure you include all that. Should be noted, Indian South Pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most. If you're trad pub, that doesn't necessarily mean I won't talk to you though. Other things it's worth noting, it doesn't have to be a new release. It also doesn't have to be out yet. I'm happy to do things for pre-order, but it doesn't have to be out yet. It doesn't have to be new. It can be 10 years old, 20 years old, whatever. Bring it in, let's talk about it. It doesn't have to be adult. It doesn't have to be a novel. It can be anthology, short stories, novellas, poetry. You know, whatever you got, bring it to me. let's talk. Let's see what we can do. And until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me. Copyright JBlack 2024.